Margaery had always trusted the grain of a room. How the light moved, how the air smelled, what the listeners looked at when they believed no one was watching. The September of Baelor smelled wrong that morning, a cloying sweetness beneath the incense and old beeswax, as if someone had spilled perfume on damp stone. She stood beneath a window of green-stained glass and let her eyes move while her handmaid fumbled with a ribbon at her sleeve. A rustle of nervous whispers ran through the benches like wind in dry rushes. The faith militants stamped their feet to quiet the crowd. The sound came up hollow from the floor. She smiled as she was meant to smile, serene, obedient, contrite, and followed the sparrows' gestures as if they had anything in the world to teach her about piety. She did not look for Loras. She did not look for her father. She looked at the floor, and at the acolytes hemming them in, and at the pale-faced boy with the reddened knuckles who kept scrubbing at a smudge near the dais with a rag. He wasn't scrubbing at all, she realized. He was waiting. His eyes were fixed upon the door Cersei would not enter. Margaery took a breath. The sweetness sat heavy at the back of her throat, like syrup left too long on a flame. She drifted back, murmuring to her maid that she needed air, and laid a steadying hand upon the girl's arm as if she needed support. A sparrow moved to block them. Margaery smiled at him. Her eyes went soft and wet. Her breath quickened. Her voice slipped into the airy fragility that elicited men's pity as easily as a thumb turned a ring. "Please," she whispered. "Just a moment, good brother. I feel so faint, and I would not disgrace the mother with a swoon." He hesitated. No one wanted a queen-to-be crumpled on the floor, and she slid past, the maid tight to her side. She did not go out. She went down, taking a small door half hidden by a tapestry into the lower passage used by acolytes. The sweetness was stronger there. She held her breath, lips pressed, and went barefoot to muffle her steps, silk whispering like reeds along a riverbank. She knew the September's lower ways, had walked them with handmaids and trays and platters, doing charity rounds for the cameras of the realm. Playing the holy fool meant seeing the holes in holy things. At the bend where the corridor turned toward the undercellars, she found another of the little birds, thin as a rake, eyes like a tufted mouse. The child's hands were white with something crystalline that cracked when it dried. "Rose," the girl breathed. "Thorn," Margaery answered, and the child's hand shot up to trace in the air a quick curl and a prickle at its stem. "This way," the girl whispered. "Now." They made the turn. Behind them someone shouted. Boots rang. Her maid smothered a sob against her sleeve. The sweetness became a stinging on her tongue. Margaery did not spare a prayer for Loras, not because she did not love him, but because love did not open doors. Love did not keep your lungs from filling with green fire. Love did not move as fast as necessity. They came out into a lightless slot where steps dropped like a jagged tooth. There was a reed mat beneath the lowest stair. Beneath the mat a hinge. The child pulled. The stair swung outward. Cold air hit Margaery's face like a slap. Salt air. She heard gulls and bells. They went into the breath of the city, into the reek and sweat, into the press of people who owned nothing and knew everything. They came up in a fishmonger's stall where a woman with a face like dried kelp shoved a basket into Margaery's hands and flung a cloak around her shoulders without looking at her. "Eyes down," the woman hissed. "Walk, don't run." The bells were still ringing when the seam of the harbor opened and a green sun rose without warning. A sound lifted through the world, a hungry roar, and the city squinted in the sudden brightness. Margaery looked back only once. She saw the September of Baelor swell and tear, glass flying, pigeons erupting, a crown of green fire blowing straight up toward a sky already falling in sparks. For a heartbeat she thought she saw the shape of a man in the opening, hands raised as if to lift the roof, and then the roof lifted him instead and he was ash and shadow, whoever he had been, and the great stone petals of Baelor rose bent and broke and fell as beams like talons raked upward out of green light. The fishmonger shoved her again. The water heaved under the blast like a struck drum. Margaery stumbled to keep her footing and the basket bit her palm. The cloak tightened around her shoulders. The child's bony fingers found her sleeve and clung there. Flames climbed in a spiral only dragons should have known. Gulls fell from the sky. Somewhere a man began to laugh and could not stop. Love did not open doors, but forethought did. There was a boat for her. A gaudy Myrish pleasure barge painted 100 shades of wine lay curtained and dead, looking far out past the common moorings. And on a signal not visible to most it came alive, drawing close as if succumbing to curiosity. Its curtains were a lure. Beneath its flounces it was lean and quick and armored like a crab. When Margaery put her hand to the rail, a sailor clasped it and knew how much pressure would bruise. He did not bruise her. He lifted her. He had the soft hands of the red wine. She did not weep until the city shrank, and even then she kept the sound behind her teeth like a jewel she did not dare show. When the wind changed, it carried ash out of King's Landing and left them to the simple sea. It carried, too, the bells that had never truly stopped. The woman who owned the fish stall watched the barge dwindle to a thread of crimson and gold, and then went on selling fish to men who pretended they had not seen anything at all. Margaery lay that night in a cabin made for a woman who never felt the cold. She did not pray. She tasted sweetness and green, and when she finally slept, she woke choking on it. A ship is a poor place to grieve. Grief must stand somewhere, and there is no standing on the mid-sea. There is only sway. By dawn she had learned to make a knot of it and store it under her breastbone like a talisman. If she untied it, she would not be able to tie anything else again. Highgarden had never looked lovelier than it did when she came home black-robed after the fall of Baelor. The bees sang on the wind, and the stewards put green daisies upon the stair, as they always did when a Tyrell daughter crossed the threshold. The air smelled of fennel and rosemary. But the people in the galleries wore pins of black, and behind the wreaths of sweet herb and white flower there were gaps where friends should have stood. Her father met her with trembling bravado and kissed both her hands and could not look into her eyes. Lord Mace boomed that the gods had spared them, that the gods had plans for his daughter yet, that they would make the lion choke on his own greed. When he said Loras's name, it caught like gristle in his throat. Olenna never pretended. She sent the servants out and took Margaery by the chin and looked into her eyes long and without flinching. "You saw him." "I do not know who I saw," Margaery said. "You saw the city die," Olenna said. "King's Landing is an old whore, and she has died a dozen times and always found her feet again. But this was a killing done by someone who understands the blade. Sit, child." Margaery sat. She did not ask who. Both of them knew. Margaery felt the knot under her breastbone, as if Olenna's old fingers had found its cord. "Listen to me," her grandmother said, and the words dropped one by one like stones in a well. "We sent a flower into a dung heap and called it politics. It is not your fault that the heap composted as dung will. It is, however, our problem that the heap is now on fire." Margaery watched a butterfly knock itself against the glass of the window. She put out a finger and it clung there, trembling. "What is left of Renly's men?" "Scattered," Olenna said. "Some of them have gone to ground. Some hang their lances on cottage pegs and call themselves farmers. Some will sell their swords to anyone who feeds them. The red wine fleet moves when we say it does. Paxter is dutiful if unimaginative. Randall Tarly weighs us against the Lannisters and finds us wanting because we are kind. He would prefer a sour master he respects to a sweet one he does not. Never mind. We will give him a reason to respect." "Cersei has the throne," Margaery said. Her voice was calm. She found she liked it exactly that way. She had no need to raise her voice for anyone. "She has nothing else. Jaime is her arm, Euron her axe. She has no food. Winter bites. A throne is a poor thing to eat." "Ah," Olenna said. "You are thinking of bread." "I am thinking of bread, and of weddings," Margaery said, and watched her grandmother's mouth tighten in amusement. "We have fed this realm for 3 centuries, Olenna said. "We have put fat on every ribs that mattered and a good many that did not. We have married clever and we have married pretty. Neither has saved us from lions." "What kind of wedding are you thinking of?" "One with snow upon the bride's shoulders," Margaery said. "One that smells of pine and smoke and damp wool. The North will not starve if we feed it. We will not starve if the North fights, so we need not. There is honor there we can spend, and grudges we must not ignite." There is a man in Winterfell who did not want a crown until it was given to him with such stubborn love, he could not refuse it. They say he went into the snow to save wildlings he did not owe, and that he died for it and came back with no taste for vengeance. A realm can be built with a man like that at one corner. A realm, Olenna repeated dryly. Do not embarrass me by turning idealist, child. An alliance that cannot be broken by the changing of the wind, Margaery corrected. The North and the Reach. The river between them carries our name, and their most loyal house carries ours. Wyman Manderly drinks us when he is thirsty and sleeps on us when he is drunk. His people have seps. They know our prayers. If we bring grain to White Harbor under our banners and our ships, and if we bring daughters who will take their gods with them without insisting the weirwoods be cut, they will put our bread in their mouths and our rose on their walls. Olenna's gaze sharpened the way a hawk's does when it drops its head before the plunge. You mean to marry? If he is wise, yes, Margaery said. If he is not, I will make him wise. And if he is a fool? If he cannot tell the scent of wildfire until it has his hair alight, then I will keep the flint away, Margaery said. We cannot make the dead live, grandmother. Loras is gone. Tommen is gone. Cersei sits on a chair for which she has poisoned the floor. You taught me to love this house and the low people who knock their foreheads on our doorstep for grain. I am tired of playing at saints for sparrows and pretty birds. Let us be gardeners. Olenna sat with her chin on her stick and her eyes on Margaery's face until the garden's noise faded to a hum and only the tick of an unseen fountain was left. Then we will send to Winterfell, she said. We will send ships in a season when ships sink, and bread when grain ledgers tell us to hoard, and a girl to a godswood where her needlework will freeze. We will send you with the red wines because Paxter's boys can count, and with Hightower men because Old Town knows how to keep a ledger honest. We will send knives you can tuck behind the sash of your dress and not bleed for. And if this Jon Snow is what you say, he will understand that a hand offered is worth twice a sword raised. And if he is not, then cut your losses and come home, Olenna said. Bring Wyman with you if you can fit him on a boat. White Harbor's water was a winter mirror when the arbor-red hulls slid into its mouth. The great Merman's Gate rose from mist like a thing that had swum up from the deep. Gulls cried around the tall towers of the new castle, and the smell of brine and smoke and hot lard drifted from the jetties where men fried river eels on iron plates to keep their hands warm. On the quay, a knot of men stood in fur and steel, their breath a fog that joined the harbor's own. Lord Wyman Manderly was exactly the shape of the rumors that had flown southward about him. A mountain of velvet and rings, his beard tufted like a drowned man's hair, his eyes shrewd as a moneylender's behind their friendly droop. Beside him stood a girl with stubbornly square shoulders and cheeks red as rose hips in the cold. Willa, Margaery guessed, and watched the girl's eyes roll over the ships with the calculation of a factor's clerk. Next to them, conspicuously slightly behind, stood Ser Davos Seaworth, his salt-stained cloak at odds with the good fur he had been given for the welcome. The stump where his finger joints ended flexed and unflexed as he watched the gangplank drop. Margaery came down, the breath already burning her throat, and sank to curtsy by the customs of the South while her body wanted to huddle itself against the cold. She did not huddle. She made the cold into part of the ceremony, letting it redden her cheekbones and pale her lips and catch her breath into a little white flower on the air. My lord, she said, and rose, and the weight in her voice made it a greeting and a presentation both. I bring you bread. You bring half the summer, Wyman said, recovering with dignity from his attempt to bow without falling. The sight of the red wine ships warms my heart. My belly needs no warming, as you'll see, but my people's stew pots do. Davos watched her, eyes narrowed not with suspicion but a smuggler's habit of measuring anyone who might change the weather of a port. Your ships came fast, he said. And quiet. Fast, Margaery said. Because Paxter Redwine knows every current between the arbor and the bight, and because he fears my grandmother's tongue more than any storm. Quiet because there are men who like to steal boats with bread in them, and have found they cannot climb a hull whose guards roll rocks at their heads. Euron is a worse thief than I ever was, Davos said. And he plays louder games. Then we will outlast his noise with our counting, Margaery said. If a thing is too large to hide, you hide it by making 100 such things and naming each of them smaller. We have 12 ships, but they will make 100 deliveries, and half will go by way of fishermen hired by the cask. We will move through Gulltown and Sisterton as often as we come through here, and if the Vale's lord is offended by commerce, he may take it up with the gods. Willa's mouth twitched with unwilling admiration. You'll need a warm cloak, she said. Your dress is very fine. It will be ruined if you fall in slush, and you will fall if you try to walk everywhere like a painting. I will try to learn how to walk like someone who has to get somewhere, Margaery said gravely, and the girl smiled outright at her. Wyman gestured with a hand on which opals caught the pallid light. We have prepared rooms at the new castle. The September here is larger than any in the north. You'll be comfortable speaking to your gods there. The gods would. He hesitated, looking to Davos as if for guidance. Is at Winterfell. I did not come to be comfortable, Margaery said. I will say my prayers where my hosts say theirs, and they will be the stronger for the breath they cost me. It will be you and the cold together that brings the north around, Davos said, half to himself. Come, my lady, there are carts and litters. The road to Winterfell is not gentle even in summer, but we'll make it as easy as we can. Winterfell was a smell before it was a sight. Margaery knew she had reached a different kind of place when the air stopped smelling of salt and began to smell of iron and wood smoke and something older, something that lived in steam and stone. They crossed the last ridge at dusk. The trees fell away and the castle lay spread in its gray like the bones of a great thing set down gently to warm itself from within. Where Highgarden flowed outward into gardens, Winterfell turned inward, wall within wall, crescent shadows nesting. Margaery drew furs tighter and watched her breath drift while the gates opened. The people who met them wore no bright cloth. Their beauty lay not in color but in cut, the practical clean lines of wool and leather, the glint and rasp of good steel. Margaery let the chill set her teeth to singing and lifted her chin. Jon Snow was not what she had expected. She did not know what she had expected. Some tower of battle, perhaps, some tall northern storm crown thing. But the man who came down the steps had a weary boy's mouth and a man's eyes. A white direwolf paced silent at his flank. The klaxon of northern stories made flesh. Behind him walked Sansa Stark, hair like a fall of copper in the dusk. Winterfell's face upon a woman who had once been a girl in Margaery's own retinue with a throat soft as cream and a smile like a song. Now that smile was a blade she sheathed and drew at will. She did not draw it yet. She watched. My lady, Jon said, and bowed not too deeply, not too shallowly, and when he straightened his eyes flicked to the ship's manifests in Davos's hands and then to the wagons piled with sacks that would be bread when the ice broke in pots. You came when we sent word, and faster. I came because your word asked and because winter did not, Margaery said. You have people to feed. I have fields that insist on growing. It seemed a match. Bread makes a man listen when oaths do not, Wyman murmured, in time for Jon to pretend he had not heard and consider the words anyway. Sansa stepped forward and took Margaery's hands as if they were only hands and not tools. You are here, she said, and there was something in her tone that was not warmth yet and not coolness still. I never thought to see you again. I am very glad that I do, Margaery said, and because Sansa had always been young and old in the wrong places, and because Margaery had never forgotten the way the girl's eyes had followed her in King's Landing as if Margaery were both map and guide, she let her fingers press warmth into Sansa's for a moment longer than courtesy necessitated. You will tell me everything I have missed. Much of it is sorrow, Sansa said, but there are other parts. I will tell you those. They put her in a room whose stone walls felt the breath of the hot springs moving under the castle like a patient beast. Even so, Margaery slept in wool. She dreamed of King's Landing and did not wake choking. Steam seeped past the tapestries in ghostly skeins. Just before dawn, she woke to the sound of something soft moving beyond the door and went to it barefoot and found the direwolf there, great as a pony, sniffing at the crack as if he could scent the uneasy dream she had left folded on her pillow. You smell chilly, Margaery whispered. and the beast's pale eyes regarded her without judgment before he moved away with the soundless assurance of a shadow that belongs. When she opened the door, she found only the corridor, and Jon, turning back to look, his hair wet, steam smoking from the collar of his tunic. "I hope he did not frighten you," Jon said. "He looked curious, not hungry," Margaery said. "I have seen many people when they thought no one was looking. He looked more decent than most." He smiled a little. The lines around his mouth eased. "He is decent," he said, so simply that she felt the truth of it like a weight in the air. They walked, not because there was anything to say that could not be said standing, but Bika. Used the motion lent the talk a shape. He showed her the yard where the men trained with spearheads of black glass, the sheds where smiths heated metal and wood and learned to set dragonglass in iron. He showed her the old broken tower and did not tell her what had been broken there. He showed her the Godswood. The Godswood was older than Winterfell and would outlast it. Snow caught in the dark hair of the branches and drifted downward in soundless flurries when a bird shifted its weight. The weirwood's face looked grave as a midwife. Steam slipped around the roots where hot water came up, fish-scented and mineral dark. Margaery had learned to pray in rooms with blue glass and crisp linen, to the painted faces of gods who liked candles and songs. The face in the tree did not look like a friend. It looked like a truth no one could soften. "I do not expect you to pray to a god that is not yours," Jon said. "I only thought you might want to see where we say our words." "Words are words," Margaery said. "The breath is the same in winter as in harvest. I will say mine here and there." She gestured north, toward the snow-locked lawns beyond the old wall. "White Harbor has a September. The Manderleys keep the 7, Jon said. "They came from the south. They have long memories for a house that had to make itself new." "So do we," Margaery said. "It's why we are here." They did not speak of marriage at first. The notion lay between their sentences like a bowl of fruit placed on a table for guests to admire and consider whether it had been set out to be eaten. Margaery spoke of grain and salt beef. Jon spoke of men and horses. They both spoke of roads. She showed him how the Red Wines would schedule their runs with an eye toward weather and the habits of pirates and princes both. He showed her how dragonglass was distributed with an eye toward ravens and snowstorms. He listened when she explained that the burden of a council is mostly in the making of lists. She listened when he explained that the strength of a war is mostly in the keeping of them. It was Sansa who first used the word wedding. She did it in her chambers where the windows looked down on the inner yard and women taught girls to draw a bow with gloves on to keep their fingers from burning on the string. Sansa had a sheaf of papers on her table and the light behind her hair made her look aflame. "Will you wed him?" she asked, and looked up not like a sister but like a lady shepherd checking a fence to see where it had been patched. "If he asks," Margaery said. "If it will keep your people fed and my people safe. If it will keep Euron's ships north of Old Town and Cersei's dogs south of Moat Cailin. If bread and oaths can be braided like a rope that will hold. And if it will keep you safe?" Sansa asked. "I will not hand another girl I know to a man because the men tell me survival is a strategy." "Then ask me if I want him," Margaery said quietly. Sansa's eyes were cold as clear water. "Do you?" "I want a man who knows the weight of a vow," Margaery said after a moment. "He does. I want a man who will not spend lives like chips at a table. He won't. I want a man who understands that a throne is only a chair a short man can climb to feel tall. He does. I want a man who does not think me less because I know how to tilt a room with a smile. He does not. Want grows on small things. It does not strike like lightning. Takes root like a winter carrot and fattens in the dark. Ask me next spring." Sansa was silent for a long moment. "He dreams he is cold," she said. "The dreams wake him. Sometimes he walks the battlements when the wind is a knife. He came back from death with something taken, but I cannot tell you what. He will not hold you by the throat and call it love." "I do not require a throat holder," Margaery said, wry and warm. "He will ask, if he thinks it will save lives," Sansa said. "I will not press him to it." "I will not press you," I will press the bakers to make 100 loaves from 90 sacks and the quartermasters to keep better ledgers. Marriage is not a ledger. It is an oath. There are too many of those broken in these halls. You sound like your father, Margaery said with a sudden ache for a man she had met only in songs and in the shape of Sansa's mouth when she refused to lie. You sound like Winterfell. That is all I have, Sansa said simply, and Margaery thought that perhaps it was enough. The Reach came north like a spring flood dressed for winter. Tyrell men wore green beneath gray. Their banners furled so their roses did not snap in the knives of the air. Margaery watched them settle into the routine of the yard and saw how the northern men watched them in turn, as one watches any unexpected migration. She walked the kitchens because a queen who does not know the heat of a hearth does not know what she is asking when she talks of bread. She ran her hands over sacks and sheaves and argued amiably with the head baker about the ratio of rye to barley. She learned the faces and names of those who had never expected a Tyrell to ask their name. She let Willa Manderly tell her how to place salt to keep it from clumping. She learned to walk on ice by walking on ice. Jon went south once to White Harbor to speak at the September. He came back with frost in his hair and a purse of sealed letters. They sat together in a room warmed by a copper pan set upon the hearth and worked through the wax at speed. The letters spoke of Euron's raids, of Cersei's new coin stamped with a crown, of Randall Tarley's men drilling under a sky as unforgiving as their lord. They spoke of Samwell Tarley in Old Town and news the Citadel had never thought it would need to send. Obsidian is as old as the First War. Dragonstone's hills are full of it. There is no iron in the world so valuable if your enemy's eyes are blue. Dragonstone, Jon said, as if tasting the stone. He rubbed his thumb along the rim of the cup and looked at the map with that odd inwardness of his, like a man who listened more keenly to the silence between sounds. The Red Wine Fleet can put men there, Margaery said. Davos can slip into any harbor. The Manderly ships will come under their sterns and take anything that falls. We can give you as many pikes tipped with glass as you have hands to hold them. But Euron will smell the smoke of our kitchens from the Shield Islands. He'll bring his monsters. We'll take him from the shore, Davos said from the doorway, as if he had been called by his name on their tongues. Put men where he isn't looking. Take what you need and be gone before he's finished roaring. The sea favors the loud until the quiet are behind them. You cannot be in two wars at once, Sansa said, stepping in on the end of his words, her fingers stained with ink. If you go to Dragonstone, you keep your army here. If you take your army south, you leave your backs to the dead. We are not taking an army, Jon said. We are taking boats and men who know how to stack stone. This is a plucking, not a battle. Margaery could feel the shape the plan would take in her body, the way a seamstress feels the fall of a dress from the weight of its cloth. Take Gendry, she said, the black-haired boy Davos found in a King's Landing forge. The one who swings a hammer because no one taught him a sword was easier on the back. He knows metal. Teach him glass. The boy is quick, Davos admitted, a complication he had not planned to admit to himself yet. He works like a man who thinks his past is after him and his future is watching. I can find him. I have friends. Bring him, Margaery said. Bring barrels. Bring anyone who can count to 20 without using both hands. We'll make a factory of Dragonstone if we must. The dead will not care if our pikes are pretty. They will care if our points find their bones. The gods tested sails and patience equally. There were weeks when the sea seemed to want to be helpful and weeks when it seemed to want to turn boats inside out like gloves. Euron's black sails moved like a rumor that proved true too often. But there is an old law of the sea that loud men kill fast and quiet men feed villages. And in that season of quiet raids and slipping harbors, the quiet were winning. Davos wore a grin like a rip in an old sail when he returned from Dragonstone looking 10 years younger for the salt in his beard. Margaery took the first dragonglass spearhead from his hands and felt the cold bite of it. Old as the world and new as this war. Dragonstone did not like being used, but it consented to it out of an old memory of oaths. They took what they could lift and left what they could not. Valyrian faces stared from stone walls and said nothing. At night, men dreamed of fire beneath the island and woke sweating. In the day, Men stacked obsidian by weight and number, and ships slid into the dark water under the frowning castle with holds heavy as sin. Winter lengthened, as if it had seen a queen widening her reach and wished to prove itself the stronger monarch. Snow fell and did not melt. Bread went from half rations to quarter ones in halls that had never known hunger. Margaery ran her finger down columns and spoke across sums and put her feet where her servants had put theirs and learned to wrap a scarf the way the old fishwives did. Twice around the throat and once around the mouth, to warm the breath before it touched the lungs. She had a rose carved in jet and hung it around her neck with a thong of leather because gold turned lip blue in the cold and no longer felt like a friend. Children found her. They always did. They learn which adults could be asked for things and which you must avoid, and if they learned it too young, they learned it only once. Margaery never minded being the one asked. She could not do everything, but she could do something, and that was its own law. In the mornings she counted sacks, and in the afternoons she counted hands. In the evening she learned to walk the battlements in fur boots beside a man who watched white sky as if it could tell him the future if he only read cloud as fluently as he read men. It was not a lightning-struck sort of wanting that grew between them. It was a fire that learned to burn without smoke. It was in the second cup of ale he poured her when the first had made her cough, and in the way he learned which fingers of hers went numb and rubbed them when no one was looking. It was in the way she learned the cadence of his silence, and in the way he did not speak when she was counting and did when she had put the stylus down. It was in the way he did not laugh at the first time she slipped in the yard and cracked her pride on her own knee. He reached a steadying hand instead and pretended not to see the tears that sprung reflexively, because you cannot be brave with your knee, only with your face. Spring had no business at all in Winterfell that year, but they made it anyway. They made it with rosehip tea and borrowed songs and the hot breath of the springs that threaded Winterfell stones like veins. They made it with a wedding in the Godswood that was not grand and was not small, though Margaery's hands shook when she touched the rough bark of the old tree and spoke words that had not been written for her. She could feel behind her the gaze of men who had decided she was worth the cold and women who wanted to see what a southern bride would do when her wedding perfume froze in the bottle. She did not cry. She did not smile too brightly. She did not look south even once. He wrapped a cloak around her shoulders in the northern fashion, and the weight of it made her feel she belonged to the weather as much as she did to the man. Later, in White Harbor, they stood before the Seven, and a Septon invoked a mother and a warrior for a pair the city had decided were not unbecomingly mismatched. That second ceremony had more light and less wind. Margaery found she liked the first better because the breath it had cost her was her own. People called Margaery Queen because they liked to call someone queen. She did not trouble to object. She was not one to be crowned. She was one to put food into hands and count spears and make a bed for a soldier who would die too soon. The North's lords had longer memories and shorter patience than Southern ones, but they were neither fools nor children. Where she overstepped, they told her. Where she asked for too little, they told her too. She learned the names of Mormont cousins and the way Lady Lyanna's chin jutted when she was ready to slam it against a table. She learned to deflect Glover's contempt with ledgers no one could argue with. She learned to look at Lord Serwyn and gauge the exact hour when his wife would be delivered, then made sure there would be hot water and a girl with steady hands to bring her a pot of broth. From the south, the news ran to gall and bile. Cersei's rule was a series of violently seized moments punctuated by silence. Euron's ships grew as if he had planted masts and watered them with blood. The Lannisters took Reachmen fields with the aid of Tarly spears. Olenna wrote letters that smelled faintly of lavender and burnt wax. The Redwynes buried sons at sea and cut grief into smaller pieces with new knots and faster work. Oldtown sent word that the Citadel had no record of a winter like this in 12 generations and advised careful diet and patience. Margaery advised bread. The first time she saw dragons, the sky looked broken. You could not expect something that large to move so fast without tearing. The rumor of the Queen from across the sea had been blowing for more than a season by then. A rumor made flesh still surprises the flesh. They came down on the slope beyond the outer wall. The snow hissed under their bellies. Men who had not been born afraid were afraid. Margaery felt a part of herself. Some girl who had once watched a joust and clapped when the pretty men tilted. Sit down hard and cover her head with her hands. The woman who walked out of that storm of hot air and steam had eyes that looked older than her face by centuries. Tyrion Lannister walked at her side, smaller, grayer. His wit sharpened like a knife kept in a drawer even when not used. Varys was there too, soft hands hidden deep in sleeves, as if he might be able to conceal them from the cold's curiosity. Jon met them in the yard where the snow had turned to slush under dragon heat. Margaery stood beside him with her rose of jet under fur. There was no courtesy to be wasted on the weather. The dragons steamed. Men held their breath and dared to look. Ghost watched the dragons with eyes that took in more than color and shape. "You are the one who will not bend," Daenerys Targaryen said without prelude, her breath a lace on the air. "I am the one who cannot afford to break," Jon said. "There is a difference." "And you?" Daenerys said, turning to Margaery with the interest of a chess player who had expected one move and found two pieces placed at once. "Are the Reach's green heart in a city of smoke?" "I am what bread looks like when it remembers it was grain," Margaery said, "because to feed a dragon or a queen you must give them something they are not expecting. We have grain, we have ships, we have cold. We have men whose bones remember oaths older than your father's songs. We do not have time." Tyrion's lip twitched. "You should have been born a Lannister," he said. "But we have enough of those." "Too many," Margaery said, and when she looked at him she thought perhaps she saw a man with ash beneath his nails forever. They did not speak of thrones. They spoke of the dead and the living, which are the only two parties worth negotiating between when winter is in the room. Dragons are very good at making points. The dead are even better at ignoring them. They agreed to an exchange of work. Daenerys would burn armies of the dead when they came, and Jon would not bring those armies south until he had done his best to break them near his own hearth. Margaery would keep men fed so the living would be harder to kill. To fight such a war was to be inside a drum struck constantly by a measured hand. Margaery learned to speak in quick lines because men had to be taken back to their ranks. She learned to sleep at odd hours because sleep happens where it falls. She learned to put her feet where she meant to in armor, because that was the only way to make the metal feel like part of you and not a complaint that followed you like a nurse. She kept her hands on ledgers and her words on lines where they would work. Often work looked like putting a bowl in a hand and saying, "Eat." Littlefinger's smile skated along the ice of Winterfell like a thing that had never learned to fall in. His eyes met Margaery's with the interest of a man who had found a mirror. He moved with the assurance of a gambler who made his own cards. He breathed in Sansa's silences as if they nourished him. Margaery watched him as one watches a crane's beak near a child's eye. When she took Sansa's arm, it was not to hold it. It was to see if the other woman would let her. Sansa let her. In nights when ledgers were set aside, they spoke in low voices about girls who had been expected to be the kind of clever that pleased everyone and had instead practiced the kind that saved lives. They did not call it sisterhood. They did not need to. When the time came to call a question, it was Sansa who called it, and the girls in the Great Hall watched a woman stand and tell a man that cleverness without honor is only a show. It was Arya who cut the show short and Peter Baelish who found there are performances the gods will not attend. People who had expected tears found none to be had. On a night that had no moon, and a wind so tired it did not rattle the banners, the army of the dead came to Winterfell like a tide. The first sign was not a sound. It was a sudden absence of sound, as if all things that spoke had been hushed. Then the horses began to shiver. Then the men did. Then the woods fell silent and the watchers on the outer walls saw them. A moving shadow that had forgotten it had ever been made of men. The dead did not roar. They fell upon the living with the sound of 1,000 knives dropped on stone. The living shape a battle and the dead ignore it. Margaery learned that the first hour, when the lines held and then did not, and then did again, and then broke, not where they should have but where any one man could not bear what his life meant to him and ran. She was not on the battlements. She was in the belly of the castle, where the women and the old and the children and the men who could not stand held their breath. She had wanted to stand on the walls, to see it with her eyes. Sansa had taken her hands and said, "Bread." And Margaery had understood. You do not put a hand that can keep another hand alive upon a blade unless there are more blades than hands. They lit trenches and saw them go out. They sent riders and saw them not return. They saw dragons rise in the black and breathed not because the dragons would save them. Margaery's heart had already learned that nothing saved anyone, but because the dragons were flame in night and the human eye is a moth. She did not pray. She did not command. She counted, and she put bowls in hands. And when panic began to yaw in the dark like a well mouth, she put her palm over its opening and said, "No." She sang once. She did not know why she did it, except that a child was making the kind of sound that breaks other children, and the song that came to her mouth was the one she had been taught when she was small. It had been about bees then, and about honey thick on bread, and about a lazy noon in the middle of summer. She sang it with her teeth chattering and found that it worked, not because of what it said, but because of what breath sounded like when it was steady. Later, men who had bled in the yard told that story as if a song had turned death back. It had not. But if the world is made of little lies we tell to make it bearable, then that was a good lie, and Margaery did not correct them. On the wall, Jon moved through breaths. He did not move through moments so much as he stitched them with a needle named Longclaw, and when he ran out of thread he used his hands, and when he ran out of hands he used his breath. He saw friends fall and strangers rise. He saw a woman he did not know cut a thing that had been a man in half and then set her jaw and do it again. He saw flames die under snow and life refuse to die under anything. He saw Daenerys bend her dragon low and watch white things climb that should not have known how to climb. And he heard the cracking of an old fear in his chest when he saw one of those white things throw long spears and lay a dragon out of the sky like a netted fish. In the end, the story that would be told was that a girl with a face no one would remember leapt like a breath and learned how to aim where the thing would be and not where it was. Jon did not see that leap. He saw the result of it as men see dawn when they did not think their eyes would ever open again. The dead stopped being a tide and became a scatter. The sound they made when they fell was like a great field blowing out a breath. The living stood still because their muscles had forgotten how to do anything else. Jon found he was speaking without words, that his mouth made shapes and no sound came out. Margaery stood in the belly of the castle and watched the fear go out of faces as if someone had opened a door and let it escape like a draft. In the pale day after, Winterfell stones steamed with more than hot springs. People went quiet the way they do when noise has been their lord too long and silence now must be courted. The dead were counted the way grain is counted, with reluctance and care. Names were said. Names were said again. Margaery took off her gloves and used her bare hands to help wash blood from armor, because it stuck better when skin was warm. She found Sansa with her shoulders set and her chin too high and pressed her forehead to hers for a breath. They did not weep. They did not need to. Daenerys looked smaller and stronger. The cold had found her bones and admired them. She smiled at Margaery once with both teeth and eyes. "You sang," she said. "They say you sang." "I counted," Margaery said. "Counting sometimes requires a tune." When spring came to Winterfell, it did not come as banners and trumpets. It came as a change in the smell of the yard and the way steam felt against the face when you leaned over the baths. It came as the slow uncurling of green things in the glass gardens, Winterfell's long quiet secret, where hot springs warmed stone channels under panes leaded like a web. Margaery had asked leave to go there months before and had not gone because there had always been a bowl to fill and a book to read. When she went, she put her hand upon the arch of old panes and smiled genuinely for the first time in a season. Inside the glass gardens, citrus ripened in a place that had never tasted such fruit from its own hand. Herbs made fragrances there that would have died at the first breath of real air. The gardeners were shy men, shy because they knew their work looked like a trick and not like the honest labor of men who bent their backs to war. Margaery bent her back next to them, and when they turned to object, she only raised a brow and said, "My hands are no more fragile than your time." She planted a rose in Winterfell. Roses did not belong to Winterfell by custom. Here they did because what belongs is what takes. Jon found her there with dirt under her nails and a smear of it along her cheek. He did not laugh. He took the cloth she did not have and wiped her face with the tenderness of a man who did not own the face and was grateful to be allowed near it. "You will have a rose here," he said, as if he were telling a story with a good ending. I will have several, she said, fierce in her practicality. One is an accident. Several are a plan. She looked at him, letting speculation be something other than a ledger. We will need to think of the South. She did not say Cersei. She did not need to. Cersei was the name men and women gave to the sour in their mouths when they woke and saw the world still made of the same hard shapes it had been before the death of the dead. Cersei remained like a stain. The war against the living queen in the South was an uglier war because it was made of choices. The war against the dead had been made of none. Sansa said, "We keep the North," with a calmness that made men not argue because they had spent their arguing already. Margaery said, "The Reach will not be ruled anymore by lions," and wrote a letter to Olenna that smelled of mint because that was the only herb that refused to be shy and insisted on growing everywhere. Olenna answered with a letter that smelled of brandy and old velvet. Tyrion wrote and wrote again. He was better at writing than any of them and worse at sleeping. They stood beneath the walls of King's Landing, and the city did not burn because there were too many people inside it whose faces you could see if you looked. Bells were rung. They were ignored. Doors were barred, not against victors but against chaos. Jaime Lannister moved like a man on a rope pulled too taut and found he had cut his own palms on the pull. In the end, a gate opened because men inside it wished their children to eat next winter. That is how gates open more often than song will tell. Cersei was not killed by a dragon. She sat in a chair and did not get up until two women came and took her arms and told her it was time to stand. She looked past them, into a middle distance where no one could join her, and smiled the smile of a woman who is about to be clever. They did not allow her to be clever. The world is a place where sometimes you are not allowed to be clever any longer because the other clevernesses have been paid out. It is a tedious thing to make a realm. War is a story because it has noise. Peace is 1,000 pothooks set at correct heights along a wall, and men who do not drink too much at their posts, and women who are allowed to say no to men who would ride away from the consequences of their yes. Margaery discovered she took to the tedium like a bird to air. She liked ledgers more than lances because ledgers did not pretend they were something else. She liked the feel of the glass garden's warm damp on her face when the rest of the world was still ironing itself out into spring. They did not take a crown. Jon did not want one, and she did not let herself consider an unneeded ornament when the rooms of the world had so much dust. The North held itself. The Reach held itself. They met in the river of trade between them where the Manderley ships sailed as if they had always meant to. Daenerys sat in King's Landing on a changed seat and learned that to sit is to be still, and that stillness is the hardest work there is. Tyrion advised and did not hold a cup too often. Sansa ruled a place that had been her father's and then had not, and discovered that a woman's patience is a better weapon than a man's sword when the day is long. Arya did not stay in rooms. Some people cannot. Samwell Tarly sent more letters than anyone else and sometimes sent joy in a jar in the form of a new way to keep bread longer without turning. The dead stayed dead, and this was the only part of the story that felt like a true miracle rather than the result of 30,000 small labors balanced on their edges like plates. Margaery walked in the glass garden one morning and found that the roses had taken. She had known they would because she had planned for everything you could plan for and then had left the rest to gods she did not expect to listen. She stood with her hands on her belly and thought she might be ready to tell him. She wanted to tell him in a place that would make sense to the telling, so that the story, when it was told later as all things are, would have a setting that deserved it. He met her there as if he had heard the thought, though he had only been looking for a place to warm the cold in his fingers. He touched a leaf with a reverence he had never turned easily toward any crown and looked at her face not because he expected an answer to some question he had asked but because he had learned the shape of it well enough to read the answers to those he had not. He saw the thing in her eyes because he had learned to look. "You have grown something," he said softly, because he was a man who would rather say things with too few words than too many. "We have grown something." "We have," she said and smiled at him. And he smiled back as if he had been allowed to set down a weight he did not know he had been carrying. Later, after the telling, after he had made an entire draft of plans in a breath that involved new walls, new beds, new ledgers, and after she had laughed at him and then kissed him for the way his mind tried to make safety of the future the way a man tries to make a fire out of wet wood, They went and stood in the yard where women taught girls to shoot and men taught boys to be still and listen. Sansa came and touched Margaery's cheek as if marking a count on some invisible tally of wins. Davos took off his glove and rubbed his thumb along the stubborn smear of dirt that had never entirely left Margaery's jaw, as if checking whether it were the same woman beneath. Willa Manderly shouted that she had guessed, and Wyman Manderly bowed and said nothing for the first time in weeks. Ghost shoved his large head beneath Margaery's hand and accepted her absent-minded scratching as his due. The rose bloomed in snow. That was the story people told later, as people always tell stories with the pieces they understand and those they do not. It was not like that. The rose bloomed in the warm damp of a glass garden built by men who had cut stone and set panes with hands cracked by cold and work. It bloomed because someone remembered to open a vent on days when the heat rose high and close it on nights when the frost crept even under glass. It bloomed because water flows when it is given a slope and not when it is commanded. It bloomed because once, a woman from the south had walked up to a tree with a face in it and said words that had not been written for her and meant them anyway. They did not build a palace. They mended a castle that belonged to ghosts and to those who could not rest. They did not have a court full of peacocks. They had a yard full of people who could set a pot over a flame and keep it there, and that was more useful. They did not settle every score. They settled ones that made bread cheaper and decent men less likely to lose fingers to other men's greed. They kept winters moving like weather and not like a fist. They learned to argue without swords. They learned to say I was wrong. They learned to say I am sorry as if it were not a shame but a duty. They learned to make several roses and not only one. In time, boys born under their roof would argue about what their names meant, and girls born under their roof would demand they be taught to hold a spear and a pen both without apology. In time, the Dragon Queen would learn to sit, and the lion's surviving cubs would learn to eat what is set before them and say thank you. In time, Old Town would write a book about the winter that had been, as if writing it down proved it could be survived, and the chapters on the North and the Reach would have more figures in them than any men had patience for, and the women would read the figures and make better ones later. In the quiet half hour just before the sun went down, Margaery stood by the glass and watched a leaf tremble. She thought of Loras and of a boy whose face she had not dared to be sure she had seen lifting his hands under the September. She thought of girls who did not get warm blankets when they needed them, and of the way Sansa's mouth set when she was planning, and of Davos's fingers, blunt and sure over a ship's rope. She thought of Wyman's laugh and Willa's scowl, and of the way the red wine banners looked in snow. She thought of her grandmother's eyes and of how pleased they would be, not with royalty, but with ledgers that ended in clean sums and winters that ended with fewer graves than they might. Jon came to her with the day's cold tucked into the edges of his hair, and she set her hand in his, and he did not ask her where she had been. It is a simple thing to put a hand into a hand. It is the shape of a world if you let it be. She did not call herself queen, and he did not call himself king. In Winterfell, titles mattered less than how you kept your watch. In Highgarden, titles had been bouquets. She had learned to prefer roots. When wind rattled the glass, the roses shivered. They did not break. Outside, the heart tree's face watched a smaller spring than it would have chosen and did not complain, because to complain is to be ungrateful for the time you were given. Inside, a woman from the south and a man from the north stood so close their breath confused itself, and the world clicked into a sound that men call peace when they do not have to be precise. And the bread rose in the ovens, and a boy in the yard learned the second notch of his bow, and a scribe in the counting room corrected a column and did not mind that no one would ever know his name, and a fisherman pulled in a net that would keep his wife from hunger, and the dragon slept, and the direwolf watched, and the snow thought about falling and waited until the morning to do it, because sometimes even weather knows when it is time to let people rest.